Beginner. I want to start with talking about, well, I want to start with explaining why, for instance, this I take Manifest Destiny on its own during this period. A lot of in this class, a lot of classes, a lot of textbooks combine the Manifest Destiny idea, the Manifest Destiny chapter, the Manifest Destiny whatever years, with what we're going to discuss next week, which is the sectional crisis leading up to the war, and they combine them together. This sort of what happens in the from 1840 to 1861, and that's certainly one way to do it. But I think, these things are so important, and in fact, the sectional crisis that we're going to talk about next week is so complicated and requires really a strong mastery of the detail, both on the lecturer and the student, that I think it's best to talk about Manifest Destiny as its own weekly subject. But also, I believe, because Manifest Destiny helps us understand a lot more about the West and the role of the West, and the role, perhaps even more importantly, the role of the idea of the West in this in this period of American history. It's interesting how people study history, and it's interesting how the study of history changes somewhat over the years. I mean, when I was in college, I think it's safe to say that I'm going to look a book for you, How the South won the Civil War. I think it's safe to say that, we obviously studied the West, probably studied how the West, expansion of slavery to the West was a problem, how it helped bring about the Civil War and things like that. But I don't think it was as strongly emphasized as it should have been. And I think that's one of the good things about the way history is done, in that historians are constantly going back over stuff, improving stuff, finding out new stuff, making new discoveries and documents and things that hadn't existed before. And the West, sorry, two people coming in the waiting room. The West becomes it becomes a much more central role to the flow of American history in this period, a much more central role to the way way you can understand American history compared to the way I learned it when I was your age. And in fact, that is one of the themes that continues on well into the 1960s. And what I was just looking up on Amazon is a very good book, an excellent book, perhaps the best history book in the last 5 years, 5 or so years, called How the South Won the Civil War. And it's about how in the aftermath of the Civil War, a lot of the attitudes, a lot of the assumptions, a lot of political ideology from the South moved west and developed west, and then went on to affect American history in the 20th century. And it's an absolutely excellent book. Opened my eyes about a lot of things. And this is the kind of thing that really shows that history is very dynamic, that things are always being improved upon, things are always being discussed in more depth than they had been before. So Manifest Destiny has become a much more powerful part of this period of American history, because we now realize, I think, just how strong the West had on the history of the rest of the country. Okay, for the longest time, the West was sort of like this outlier, and the West was. We talked about it a little bit, but it isn't as central as these other things. And I think not only this newer generation of historians, but certainly Heather Cossack Richardson, who wrote how the South won the Civil War shows us that was really a skewed way to look at history. The other thing is that the phrase manifest destiny is very interesting, because one of the things you're going to notice as you do your reading and as you go through the textbook and the reader and all that stuff is that manifest destiny means that not only the expansion of the United States throughout the rest of the continent, throughout the West and California and Pacific Northwest and things like that, was inevitable, right? It was destiny, because it was happening while the people involved in it were living, and they were actually seeing it happen. It was being made manifest for them, right? So the idea about the justifiability of it and the inevitability of it is obvious, supposed to be obvious to people at the time, because it's happening. It's obvious what's going on, and it's obvious that this is the way things were supposed to be, and perhaps more importantly, this is the way. Sorry, I got my leg stuck in my chair. Stay young. Whatever you do, just stay young. When you get to be my age, you do stupid stuff, and then you get twisted around. Your body gets entangled, can't get out. Anyway, these things are mutually reinforcing. Okay, that the more the U.S. expanded west, and the more that they talked about the righteousness of it, the more they talked about the racial aspects of it, and that these racial aspects were the way of the world, they just reinforced each other. Okay, so that, when you're a little kid, you just sort of assume the continental United States, that is the lower 48, if you will, were the way things were supposed to have ended up. And that wasn't the case at all. But the notion was very, very powerful. And as I say, it kept reinforcing itself. It was also, and this is one of the reasons not to split the subjects up, not to split manifest destiny and the sectional crisis up, is that slavery had an awful lot to do with it during the whole period. So the 1840s and 50s is 30s, 40s, 50s is just about as much about slavery as it is about anything else. But I like to separate it in order to get this Western stuff a little more attention than it deserves. But that also means that this lecture is a little bit shorter than the other lectures I usually give, and the recorded lecture that I put on your course module is a little shorter. I want to make sure I put it up for you as well as for the morning class. Is a little shorter than the other ones. Yeah. Okay. So that's the kind of justification for the rationalization of manifest destiny at the time and now. So slavery becomes the dominant issue in this period, no doubt, because of territorial expansion. The United States is during these 25, 30 years going to become almost twice the size it was. And the question becomes, what do we do with all this new territory? To make a long story short, although we're going to keep coming back and back to it, as the U.S. moves west, Southerners realize here's our chance to sort of overwhelm these Yankee abolitionists who are starting to make a lot of noise and starting to justify their opinions and their abolitionism based on religion and all sorts of other things, because we can, by adding more states, we can by definition add more slave states, and therefore we won't get outvoted in Congress, or we won't get overwhelmed in Congress, or slavery won't be, excuse me, I have to cough, so I'm just going to turn the thing off here for a second while I do that. Sorry, that was a particularly bad one. Took a long time. Not that you want to know about my pulmonary weaknesses. So the idea is that then slavery won't be voted out of Congress, won't be made illegal easily by a northern dominated, free state dominated Congress. That there will be at least, if not a 50-50 split between the new states, though it'll be close enough that with the overrepresentation of slave states in the House of Representatives, it's easy for us to fend off any challenge to the legitimacy of slavery. Okay, so these run hand in hand, because when there's new land acquired, the question of what type of land, how the way that land will be worked, it becomes center stage. Okay, so what happens is that, of course, as you know, California and Oregon sort of get settled first. There's a sort of blank in the middle, not a blank, but that's the way lots of people thought of it, of white settlers. Native Americans are moved in there with the Cherokee removal and stuff like that. But the West doesn't develop as a slow unrolling carpet of Easterners bringing their civilization all the way across the continent. It develops in sort of patchwork way. The patchwork way is that the Pacific West Coast is settled first, and then there's kind of infill in the middle. So some key points are an example of Americans settle in Oregon, which had been sort of the Oregon Territory had been jointly administered by the U.S. and by Great Britain. Sorry, I don't know where that came from. And also started to move into Utah, which was owned by Mexico. And these were settlers who just moved out there. You know, they willingly gave up their position, their residence in an eastern state, and moved to the West because they, for all sorts of reasons, wanted land. They wanted all kinds of other stuff. Okay, Utah, by the way, was part of Mexico at this time. And a lot of this is already justified in the 20s and 30s by people saying that God wanted the United States to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's not hurt by the fact that Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821. And lots of people think that, okay, Mexico is now independent from Spain, but it's also going to be weaker than it was under Spanish rule. So there's more chance of us to, there's more likelihood we're going to be able to settle out there and become and be less harassed, say, than we would be by a Mexican government, which was backed up by the Spanish government. Excuse me. Sorry. Huh. Anyway, Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821. As the news filters down and this becomes sort of accepted, people start to move. And the northern frontier of Mexico was California, New Mexico, and Texas. And New Mexico is not with the state of New Mexico. It was basically the whole area between California and Texas. Okay. So what happens is that the Mexican government dissolves the mission land holdings in this area. Missions in the West, missions in what was northern Mexico, were huge, right? The church would send out a missionary, they'd establish a church, they'd establish a village, and they'd establish land around it. And they'd more or less own all the land. Tax revenue from that was difficult to claim. Sometimes Mexico didn't even bother. Sometimes Spain didn't bother trying to tax it at all. And the Mexican government realizes that not only can they tell that cattle ranching is becoming a bigger and bigger deal among white migrants moving west, but here's all this land, we could sell the damn stuff. We don't need to just keep holding it in the control of the church. And so that's what they do. They dissolve the land holdings around mission towns and mission areas. Not the missions themselves, right? But they solve the land titles for the missions and start to either lease them out or sell them, or lease them out. And a new group of people called Californios, Californios, which is a new class of Mexican cattle ranchers. That group grows in the 1830s in response to this. So you already have a big change in the Mexican territory because of this this movement by the government. So at the same time, and certainly by 1840, trade from the east to California is becoming much more common. New England ships are going around the tip of South America, and they're coming up to California. They're noticing that the settlement is possible. They're noticing the trade is possible. People in California are demanding finished goods from the east and all that sort of stuff. To a certain extent, although not as commonly, goods would travel overland to California via the east, but that took a much longer time. It was better to go through. It really isn't until the railroads arrived that becomes important. But we shouldn't dismiss the amount of goods that come to the California by ship, because it's an enormous amount. Okay, you know how it is with human beings; they're just relentlessly trying to trade and relentlessly trying to effectively make money, and they'll do almost anything and go almost anywhere in order to do that. So the idea of having to put your stuff on just a second, Will is trying to get in. The idea of expanding your cabinet making business, and well, I shouldn't say cabinets weren't really, the cabinets were kind of homemade throughout the idea of expanding your even say luxury item like piano making business to the degree that you start making extra pianos that you then ship out on a ship all the way around the Cape and up to California isn't so radical. Okay. Obviously some people overextend themselves, but most traders don't overextend themselves. And California is seen as this kind of frontier. So that's very, very important. The second thing that's going on is that, so in other words, we're trying to say Eastern influence is reaching California during this whole period through trade. The second thing is that the first part of Mexico to be settled by significant numbers of Americans was Texas. Enough white Americans were coming west into Texas, led by a man named Moses Austin. He made an agreement with the Spanish government that they could come out there, and that they would be granted a certain amount of land. But of course, when the Mexican government takes over, it starts to get a little bit worried by all these transplants, and starts to wonder, well, what does this mean? Does this mean, in theory, we're going to end up in a border war with the Americans? Because after all, these Anglos are coming out. They're technically under Mexican law, but a lot of them aren't following Mexican law, and stuff like that. And that's not helped by the fact that Moses Austin's son, Stephen Austin, becomes a very strong leader of the Texicans. These are the people who live in Texas, but who moved to Texas, but are white, and are sort of rubbing up against Mexicans in Texas. Start to demand more autonomy from the Mexican government. The Mexican government, they want to be left alone by the Mexican government. They don't necessarily want to form their own Texas Republic. That does happen, but that's a little bit later. But it's pretty obvious to the Mexican government, these are not people that are going to assimilate into the general Mexican population. Okay, so what the government does is that the Mexican government does in 1830 is it annuls existing land contracts and bars future emigration from the United States. Okay, this is a very, 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 very big deal. This only heightens the desire among the Texicans to have more autonomy from Mexico. They increase their appeals to the United States. and to relatives back in the East to send more people, to send more send more support, send more money, send more goods. To the extent that General Santa Anna, the leading Mexican general, has to send an army to Mexico, to the Texas area in 1835 to sort of put down this rebellious group of Texicans, this rebellious group of Anglos. And of course, the rebellious group of Anglos form provisional government, and they call for Texas independence. There's a big battle about this of the Alamo, which of course the Mexicans win. But then eventually Sam Houston, another Texican, defeats Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto and wins independence for Texas. So you have a Texas Republic. This new Texas Republic design, I'm overly summarizing. The details are more in your book, but it's important to keep moving here. Texas wanted to be annexed by the United States, but neither Andrew Jackson nor Martin Van Buren acted on it because it was the problems with adding another slave state and stuff like that. So Texas is its own Texas Republic. Now, some of you may have been noticing in the news this year, particularly with the aftermath of the election and the backlash against what people thought were even though Texas went Republican, people thought were invalid votes and everything, and people complaining that the Texas state government is changing a lot of voting rules, making it more difficult for people to vote. There are a lot of people in Texas who want to revive the idea of Texas being an independent republic. And this happens every 50, 60 years. This happened during the civil rights era in the 60s. Few states even said, well, we want to break off again and that sort of stuff. But they don't do, but that obviously hasn't happened in our lifetime. But it's a sort of a common Texas thing to be independent minded. Anyway, that brings us to the election of in 1844. Extremely important. Texas annexation is still an issue. The issue of what to do about slavery and the possibility of the annexation of Texas is a main issue in the campaign. James Polk, who's a Tennessee slave owner and by the way, a friend of Andrew Jackson's, received the Democratic nomination. He supports Texas and annexation. He supports sort of taking over Oregon from British control, or taking over the half of Oregon that's in British control. He's very much a Western, very much a manifest destiny kind of person. And he defeats Henry Clay in a close election. Okay. So what happens? Texas wants to join the Union. Polk wants to have a reason, an excuse, a policy that allows the Washington government to be more forceful in creating this Western America. So coming into office is these four goals. I'm going to talk about them just really in passing. The first two were, one's about the tariff, reducing the tariff. The other one is to establish an independent treasury, reestablish an independent treasury. And he wants to settle the Oregon dispute, but perhaps more importantly, the most important for our purposes anyways, is Polk wants to bring California into the Union. This again is after he becomes inaugurated in 1845. So he initiates a war with Mexico to get California. And of course, where that fighting doesn't necessarily take place right away in California, it takes place in Texas. Okay, fighting starts in Texas. Texas still has a sort of disputed border area with Mexico, what eventually becomes known as the area that's part of the Gadsden Purchase, at the very southern sliver of the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and part of Texas. There's a lot of fight over that. And although most Americans were supported the war, they believed in manifest destiny. there was a vocal minority really who complained that, look, the problem here is that Polk wants to in addition to gaining more lands for the West, he wants to support slavery. He wants to strengthen slavery in the South and have it expand at least partly to the West. And so there's this group of anti-war people who protest the war, and a very famous writer, as you know, Henry David Thoreau, writes this pamphlet called, and by the way, he'd been thrown in the clink, thrown in the slammer because he didn't want to pay taxes that help support the war. And while he's in the slammer, he writes this thing called On Civil Disobedience. It's a very important pamphlet. It talks about how doing things like the what he thinks of as the moral responsibility to be disobedient to a government when you disagree with that government's a big government policy on moral grounds. And he very much disagreed with the Mexican War on moral grounds, hence not paying the war tax, hence being thrown in the slammer. Now, this On Civil Disobedience pamphlet gains a lot of attention in the East and a lot of attention in the North. And it gains the attention of a certain Illinois congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln. You know, heard of him. He stood up in Congress and he questioned Polk's right to declare war and said that the president can declare, or the president can ask for a war, Congress has to declare war. But the problem Lincoln sees is that, now remember, Lincoln is just one little guy, not little, one tall guy, but only one guy from a congressman in the House of Representatives from Illinois. He's not leader of a party. He's not eventually what he becomes, what he becomes eventually. But still, he is part of this anti-war group, and he says, look, the president can the way things are, the president can kind of force a war, get Congress to jump on with public opinion, declare war, without really telling us a lot of details about what's going to happen, why we're doing this, why we're why we're actually going to war, putting lives on the line. So Lincoln introduces this resolution in the Congress that says Polk has to tell us exactly what the policy of the war is going to be. What is this? What's he want? What's he going to do? What's his plan? Okay. This resolution fails, obviously, but sorry, I just spilled water on my keyboard. I have a drinking problem. Ha ha ha. But it sort of gains a lot of attention for this thing about, well, wait a minute now, you know, if we were going to war with Texas, but it's really going to war to support the expansion of slavery from the East to the West, then the whole nation has to agree to it. The whole nation doesn't agree to it, so it's an illegitimate war. Anyway, so that opinion becomes very strong. It's not a majority. It's probably 40-45%. But it riles up, if you will, the anti-slavery groups, the abolitionist groups in the Northeast. Now, this is still, right, the 1840s. And Southerners pay attention, right? They're like, oh, okay. It's bad enough that we have these Yankee preachers from New York coming down south and coming into the Midwest and talking about the evils of slavery. It's bad enough that we have these Yankee hardline Protestants from New England founding anti-slavery and abolitionist colleges throughout Ohio and Indiana and places like that. It's bad enough that the Underground Railroad, as small as it is being supported at least ideologically, if not monetarily, by these meddling Yankees. Now we have a congressman standing up from the North, although originally, of course, Lincoln's from the slave state, Kentucky, standing up and saying, you know, we want the government to be having a war with Mexico, but that is really about underlying the motive is slavery. So this pisses off a lot of Southern white landowners. And again, like I've been saying all along in this section of the class, this only intensifies the justification for slavery. Remember how I talked about how in the 1800s, slavery was considered this necessary evil. Oh, well, it's terrible, but it's the way things are. And, maybe someday it'll eventually die off. Well, slavery becomes seen as a positive good in this period. And that is only helped by this Northern fervor to stop slavery. So anyway, that's the kind of kitchen sink of issues that are going into this Mexican war. There's Manifest Destiny itself. The U.S. wants to be a larger player on the international scene than it is, and also this Polk is a supporter of slavery, wants to have a slavery foothold in the Southwest. So what happens? Well, essentially there are three big battles. There's the battles on the front in California. There are battles in Santa Fe around what is now northern New Mexico, and General Winfield Scott even captures central Mexico and Mexico City, the capital. This is a pretty shortish war. It's a quickish victory for the United States, and leads to what a very famous treaty, which not only has to do with the finishing up the war and wrapping up the war and what's going to happen after the war, the relationship between the two countries. It actually helps define or ignores, I should say, the question of American citizenship, and I'll get to that in a minute. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. U.S. gains California, present-day New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, sort of filling in that western part between the Louisiana Purchase and the coast. Okay, the U.S. doesn't get this for free. However, it isn't as if the Mexican army, the Mexican government was completely crushed. They agree to pay Mexico $15 million for this land. Now that's a steal. It's an absolute steal. It's a steal because they're able to get it at that rock bottom price because, of course, they win the war. But it's not, they don't literally just take it over. So what happens during this period in the immediate aftermath of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is you have this whole territory where residents kind of have these multiple citizenship, multiple identities. I don't mean that they have multiple personalities or anything like that, but there are people who were really originally Mexican, but now they're American. Some people in some of the more remote areas still follow Mexican law. Some people follow American law, and then some people switch between American law and Mexican law, using whichever one happens to be fit their own purposes at the moment, because the United States doesn't have enough power to go out and establish courthouses everywhere across this new land. There are a lot of there's a lot of loosey-goosey stuff going on. Now, it's not all legitimate. It's not like suddenly the drug trade or anything is able to flourish in this area like a sort of Breaking Bad situation. But what happens is there's a kind of rough and tumble place. You have to sort of figure out the lay of the land in wherever you are in order to understand what your position is, what your status is in the New West. There's also the problem, of course, the Comanche are there. And the Comanche are a very powerful Native American group. They're not, their power is not subdued until the 1860s and 1870s. Okay, so what I'm saying is you have at least, at a minimum, three groups of people: the Texicans, the Mexicans, the Texican Americans, the Mexican Americans, and the Native Americans, all in that one area, all having sort of three different ideas of who they were and who was in charge. And this brings up the question of race. Let me just make sure no one's asking a question, because I have the Zoom in the background. Okay, and let me take a drink of water while I'm pausing. it brings up the question of race because, of course, there are these more or less three different groups involved, and because of although I have to say Native American concerns were not taken into account. The dominant groups were, of course, the white Americans and the Mexican Americans. What was I going to say? Oh, okay. Now, race in the mid 19th century is really sort of an amorphous notion. It involves color, it involves culture, national origin, class, involves religion. Anglo-Saxon Protestants coming from the East were considered themselves very progressive. They were the people who were moving civilization across the continent. They were the people who loved liberty. They didn't call anybody boss. They didn't dominate. They didn't bow down to a church, and so they were everything that Blacks, Indians, Hispanics, and Catholics were not. Right, and this fed very much into Manifest Destiny. We're taking over these lands that have been controlled by Indians before, controlled by Mexican Americans before, partly because they're not able to exploit them the way they should be exploited. They're not using the lands the way God intended them to be used, and therefore it has every right for Americans, white Protestant Americans to take over. That's Manifest Destiny. And of course, as I said at the beginning, the fact that it's happening right before their eyes just reinforces the idea. Okay, but the imposition of American systems of race relations really took away a lot of freedom from many residents. Mexico had abolished slavery and declared people of Spanish, Indian, and African origin equal before the law. Well, that changes in Texas. Texas Constitution not only included protections for slavery, but also denied civil rights to Indians, denied civil rights to free people of African origin, right? So there's this constant. So in other words, this whole chunk of land in between the Louisiana Purchase and California is a continual problem, because about everything that could rile up people was there to rile up people. Land being taken over, different racial groups, different legal systems that dealt with different racial groups differently, right? People were suddenly in the 1830s, they're Mexican, and all of a sudden they're controlling Mexico, and all of a sudden, boom, they're under the control of Texas, the Texas Republic, then the United States, and the laws have changed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's in sort of constant turmoil. And one of the ways that the United States tries to, if you will, dampen down this turmoil is to impose stronger restrictions and enforce the law perhaps more strongly in the Texas area than in other places of the country. Okay, so it really is a question of the carpet of civilization rolling out west, but then rolling over people who already live there, right? And trying to smother them, and trying to say that the white American Protestant version of what should happen in the West is what's going to happen. Okay. All right, then bada bing, bada bing. Gold is discovered in California. 1848, Sutter's Mill, California. You know all this. This is all standard flashcard history stuff. Just to give you an example, a little fun fact of what happened. The non-Indian population of California in 1848 was 15,000. Okay, that includes Mexicans, white Americans, people on the coast, everybody. Non-Native American population amounted to 15,000, but it climbed to 360,000 by the outbreak of the Civil War. And within 12 years, it's, I don't know, whatever, quadrupled or something like that, however you calculate that number, I don't know. It was a very, very big transformation. And of course, gold rush fever struck a lot of people, and a lot of people went out west thinking they would become rich. Now, the old story, of course, the old cliche is the person who gets rich during the gold rush is not the miner, not the speculator, not the guy out there with his pickaxe and shovel digging for gold, but it's the guy who sells the shovel and the guy who sells a pick. And that's certainly true. And what happens is there's enough gold in California and also in Nevada, but also silver and also opportunities for ranching and other sort of mineral supplies, copper and whatnot. So the gold rush is mostly sort of headlined by gold, but there are these other economic developments and other economic resources to be exploited, and that's what happens. Okay. By the way, lots of people get involved in this. Latinos get involved. Europeans come over. Chinese people come over and get involved. So it really is a rush. People do rush into the area and sort of try to get as much as they can when they can. And this means, of course, that because these racial things continue throughout this period, Californians or white miners in California pretty quickly expel foreign miners from their prospecting areas. Hang on a second, I didn't turn my phone off. I should have done that. I thought I had done that and I didn't. Okay. What was I saying? So white miners expel foreign miners from their prospecting areas. Okay. And gradually and increasingly, basic rights are cracked down upon for Indians. Basic rights for Indians, Native Americans, Asians, blacks were all cracked down on in California, right? So thousands of Indian children were declared orphans. Some were bought. Some were sold as slaves. Some were, it is incredible sort of dominance of white culture in California because of the gold rush, because of this massive and relatively quick infiltration of California by this outside population. And by the way, even though I just said that the Latinos, Europeans, and Chinese come in, but almost all the Europeans are white. Almost all the Europeans are white Protestants. And of course, most of the people from the American East are white and Protestant. So there is this very strong sense in which not only does manifest destiny roll with itself, but racist restrictions based in law roll out in the West too. Okay, and finally, what I want to talk about as a sort of culmination of manifest destiny is the idea of the Pacific. Okay, like I said, there's always this kind of hankering for more stuff, for more trade, for more contact with the outside world. There's this sort of constant American belief that expansion is always going to be better. And of course, the next thing that people want to do once footholds in California are established, once the sort of structures of life and economy are established there, is they want to open up trade in the Pacific, okay? Especially on the Asian mainland and the islands off the coast of Asia itself, especially Japan, especially the Philippines, especially China. Well, here's the problem. The Japanese had more or less shut down the country for a couple of centuries. They had been sort of went into a period of isolation. They were strong enough to hold off the competing groups of Chinese people, the Chinese groups, from conquering. They had become powerful in their own way. They felt that they had reached the apex of civilization. There was no need to be dealing with other countries or trading with other countries. Well, Japan had also become very rich, and American traders, American merchants said, "Oh, wait a minute, we need to crack open that market." So the U.S. Navy is sent. Commander Matthew Perry sails warships into Tokyo Harbor and more or less demands that Japan negotiate a trade treaty with the United States. This is 1853, 1854. Well, okay, that's fine in a way. Almost not fine, being a big bully on the block, but the Japanese have no response for this. Okay, they don't have the power of the American warships, and eventually they agree to open up 2 of their ports to U.S. Merchant ships in 1854. And then later in the decade, they established full diplomatic relations with the United States, the first, if not the first, then the first major country with which Japan opened itself, for which Japan opened itself in the 1850s. Yeah, now here's another crucial thing about that. In order to get to Japan, you have to establish a certain number of way stations. You know, you got to stop in Hawaii and pick up supplies. You got to stop in Midway and pick up supplies, all the way across the Pacific Ocean. So gradually during this period, then because of the opening up of Japan, these other places become almost just as important in American consciousness and American trade, in American military power as Japan itself and as coastal Asia itself. So the United States pays a great deal more attention to what's going on in the Kingdom of Hawaii. The United States starts to look at the Philippines and say, oh, holy cow, the Philippines is this amazing place with 1,000 great natural harbors and the whole sort of Southeast Asia as its, fruits for the picking. And this is the first time that the United States can really start to think of itself as a major imperial power, which of course culminates eventually in the Spanish-American War at the end of the century in 1898. But it all kind of starts in this first period at the sort of rolling out of Manifest Destiny. So while the United States, apart from Hawaii and for the Philippines, well, I shouldn't say apart from Hawaii and the Philippines, those are big deals. The United States doesn't conquer territory on the mainland of Asia so much. It definitely, Manifest Destiny doesn't stop at the California coast. It continues, the very least of the idea, the conception of Manifest Destiny continues across the Pacific, and then only gets stronger in that sense after the Spanish-American War. Okay. Any questions about this? There's obviously a lot more detail about it in your book. Yes, no? Did I put everyone to sleep because I'm so interested in conceptions of history? I can't tell whether anyone's paying attention because they're just your names. I don't see anybody moving. There's some pictures, but that's all I see. And by the way, Sam has the best picture of anybody in either class, the morning class or the mute is locked. Oh. Dave Coleman says the mute is locked. Huh. Well, anyway, Sam has the best picture of, it looks like it's taken of him at Mount Washington of any of the classes I have this semester. So you get little brownie points for that, Sam. All right. Well, in that case, I will see all of you on Thursday. Okay. Adios.
Have a good one.